The physician was already at the door. The bag held everything the operation would need: bandages, compresses, linens, sponges, and a saw. Peregrine's leg had rotted past saving. The stench alone drove people from the room before they'd even seen the wound. There was only one procedure left to perform. The physician laid out his instruments and began cleaning the blade that would take the leg. Then, as he was about to operate, the physician suddenly stopped the procedure. Forlì, Italy, 1280s. Years before disease had threatened to take his leg, Peregrine Laziosi was not a man of prayer. He was a man of fists. Forlì stood in open revolt against Rome. Pope Martin IV had placed the entire city under interdict. No mass, no sacraments, no burial rites. And Peregrine was not on the sidelines of that revolt. He was one of its ringleaders. Rome sent no army to Forlì. It sent one priest. His name was Philip Benizi. He carried no weapons. He asked for nothing but peace. To the other men of Forlì, he was an unwelcome visitor. To Peregrine, he was the enemy in the flesh. Philip opened his mouth to speak. The crowd closed it with stones. Insults turned to blows, blows turned to a mob, and at the center of it stood Peregrine, who didn't throw a stone, he used his hand. He struck the priest across the face and sent him to the ground. An unarmed man of peace beaten by the men he'd come to reconcile. This was supposed to be where the story ended for Philip Benizi. A bloodied robe, a lesson to Rome, a city that answered the Pope's messenger with a fist. Philip rose from the ground. The men around him braced for the only response they understood: a curse, a threat, a call for soldiers to finish what stones had started. Instead, Philip looked directly at the man who had struck him. "I forgive you." No fist raised in return, no name reported to Rome, no soldier summoned. Just 3 words, spoken to the man who had just tried to put him in the dirt. Peregrine had spent years learning how to fight. He knew exactly what to do with an enemy. He had no idea what to do with the man who refused to be one. Christ had not answered violence with violence. He had let it fall upon himself and answered it with mercy. Centuries later, on a street in Forlì, Peregrine had felt the same mercy land on him, in the face of a priest he'd struck to the ground. He could not walk away unchanged. The fists were the first thing to go. The agitator who had once organized crowds against Rome now knelt alone in silence. The hands that had struck a priest now folded in prayer, and what began as remorse hardened, over time, into discipline. He resolved never to sit when he could stand. Not for a day, not for a season, for years. Decades passed, and Peregrine remained on his feet, through sermons, through vigils, through nights that should have broken him. The habit that began as penance became one of the defining marks of his religious life. But standing was not the real reversal. It was that Peregrine had once hated the Servites enough to attack one on the street. Now, he asked to become one. He put on the same habit Father Philip Benizi wore. He knelt under the same rule Philip had lived by. And when his formation was complete, Forlì received him back. Not as the agitator who had once tried to drive the Servites out, but as a Servite priest himself. The city that had watched him throw a punch now watched him hear confessions. The hands that had struck a man of God now anointed the sick, fed the poor, absolved sinners. Every ounce of strength he had poured into conflict, he now poured into service. Then came the famine. Grain failed. Wine ran out. The people who had once feared Peregrine's fists now came to him hungry. He did not organize, he did not agitate, he did not fight for resources the way he'd once fought for a cause. He prayed. As Christ had once multiplied loaves for a starving crowd, the grain and wine in Forlì did not run out. The transformation was total. The fist had become a blessing. The rebel had become the servant. The man who once knocked a priest down had spent his life since raising others up. For decades, Peregrine had built his life around a simple act of penance. When he could sit, he stood. Then the very thing that made that sacrifice possible began to fail him. A wound appeared on one of his legs. It didn't heal, it grew worse. Peregrine had given everything he knew how to give. He had given up the violence of his youth. He had surrendered his ambitions, his old loyalties, his comfort. He had given his life to prayer, his strength to the poor, and for decades, even the simple comfort of sitting had been offered to God. Now it seemed God was asking for the very thing that made that sacrifice possible: his leg. A cancerous wound had grown so severe that the flesh was decaying. The sight and smell became unbearable, and eventually the physician determined that there was only one option left. The leg would have to be amputated. Peregrine accepted it, but the night before the operation he dragged himself before an image of the crucified Christ and prayed. There, exhausted, Peregrine fell asleep. In his sleep he saw Christ descend from the cross, approach him and touch the diseased leg. Morning came. The physician arrived, prepared for the amputation, carrying the instruments necessary for an operation that in that age carried dangers of its own: bandages, medicine, a blade, and a saw. And when he uncovered Peregrine's leg, there was no cancer left to amputate. The wound was gone. The diseased flesh had been restored. Peregrine had been prepared to surrender the leg that had carried him through decades of penance. But Christ, whose wounded body Peregrine had contemplated that night, did not take it. He made it whole. The man who had once tried to bend 40 to his will by force had finally bent his own will completely. He had offered God everything. He had offered God even the leg beneath him. And when morning came, Christ had given it back.